Today is Tuesday, April 14th, 5 p.m. Miami time, and I'm here with Robert Levit. Robert, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to speak with me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So Robert, I'm curious, where are you now, and how have the recent events surrounding this COVID-19 virus affected the structure of your life and your work?
I'm at my home in Toronto, not very far from where I work at the University of Toronto, but I haven't been there at least more than 2 weeks. And I think, like everybody else, in patterns which have become quickly familiar to everybody, that I have been immersed in Zoom and other forms of online meetings. I'm an administrator at the University of Toronto as well as a professor, and so I'm also teaching online with all of its challenges, although not as terrible as I originally thought it would be, but still strange, and it does pose some real challenges in terms of the kind of, I guess, rapidity and ease of communication that we're all accustomed to. So it has changed. I mean, the bigger changes, I think, are to come from a work point of view, just in terms of dealing with the logistics of potentially a long stretch of online teaching and international travel, the logistics of delivering university education. Not to mention also coordinating and dealing with professional work issues as well. So. I think, though, I think that the changes are quite mine are quite standard. I've heard them a million times now in television interviews and discussions with friends. So I know, Carie, you have some other questions for me.
I'm just curious, are you currently teaching both design and lecture courses?
No, I'm teaching a thesis, what we call a thesis research studio. So it's a studio which is small in number. I have 8 students, and they are doing work in preparation for their thesis. So it's a combination of research, but I've structured it so that they also are undertaking preliminary design explorations for their eventual thesis projects.
So you think the individualized nature of that work makes it easier to transition into online learning?
Yes, because I have, it might differ from group to group, but I often do conduct a class through individual tutoring and desk crits. The other students are always invited to participate, so they are often online listening to desk crits, and they can see what the progress of their classmates are. But the discussions tend to be very individualized, also because it is a thesis studio. The projects are more they're more distinct from each other than in a normal coordinated studio. So in that respect, this individualized interaction is easier than I think it might be in a more conventional studio. And I'm not teaching a lecture or seminar this semester. There was another thought that I've had in this new period of working from home. And it made me think a little bit about a book I'd read years ago by Catherine Greer called, I believe, Comfort Society or something of that sort. And in that book, she was talking about the way in which, the development of, I suppose you might call it an ideology or a sensibility that was built around intimacy, the construction of intimacy in the home, but at the same time that intimacy was being constructed with an eye towards the publicity of the home, that the way that the exhibition of taste through the construction of one's interior environment was something that was also intended for public consumption and often guided by popular journals on design and furnishings. So somehow, now all of a sudden, we're all stuck in our houses conducting meetings with work colleagues, sometimes people we work with on a regular basis, but sometimes clients or strangers who we would never have in our homes. And so how we present ourselves, how we construct our backgrounds and environments is all of a sudden one in which we have a newfound occasion for this collision of I suppose, privacy on the one hand and publicity on the other. So it's kind of interesting to see the way people set themselves up in front of the camera, what they use as backgrounds, whether it's something which they're very self-conscious about, or in some cases quite unself-conscious about. You know, of course, Zoom allows you to utilize avatars, and though using an avatar suggests that you're hiding something, so then there's a whole question, at least I have that feeling of some anxiety about whether or not the use of an avatar is a signal of something that you're hiding. All of this makes me think there are some passages in David Foster Wallace's book Infinite Jest where he described the adoption of video conferencing. I guess this was before it was, you know, commonplace, and how at a certain point when everybody in industries that built avatars for yourself and for your environment, so like in Instagram, you know, you could always be on vacation in your avatar furnished video conferencing. But then there was a renegade group, I guess, you know, a youth movement that began to utilize only voice calling. And it was they were considered a real vanguard, and all of a sudden the industry producing avatars for backgrounds and, you know, kind of plastic surgery avatars collapsed, and all of a sudden people returned to voice. And so recently somebody said, well, okay, well, let's set up a Zoom meeting. And I said, can't we just talk on the phone? So they said, oh, okay. As if they'd forgotten that we could do that. So we did, we spoke on the phone.
The norm has changed very quickly. You're right about that.
Anyway, so we'll see where all that goes.
So Robert, being home, and of course it's relatively early on, at least in Miami, we've been in this situation similar to you in Canada, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the longer term implications that the recent events may have on the world of architecture or the future design of cities, if any.
Yeah, well, of course, we've all been thinking about that. And I did watch something, actually, not in preparation. Well, I guess nobody prepared for this pandemic, or not most of us, but there was something about the Spanish flu on TV, and they were talking about the way in which in the 1920s that there was a almost immediate state of oblivion in relationship to the dual nightmare of World War I and the Spanish flu. So sometimes I think that when people talk about the long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is possible that as soon as there is herd immunity, perhaps in 2 years, that people will like wake up from a dream and forget that the whole thing happened, and it will be left to experts to continue to worry, as it usually is. But you know, who knows? I mean, the discussions around the ongoing threats that come from globalization and the incursions into new territories that will bring new diseases with them, I suppose. I mean, it may be that people remain more conscious of threats of the sort that we're going through right now. But I have also, I mean, I think people are thinking about changes that might be wrought upon both practical responses, but also changes in sensibility at the scale of architecture and perhaps of the city. One of the big challenges, say, in a city like Toronto has been, you know, the downsizing of apartment units. So they've grown smaller and smaller as the real estate values have gone up and up, and construction costs have gone up and up. So I have wondered to myself in the last few days if, you know, a possible impulse to move into somewhat less dense environments might combine with, you know, a desire for a different kind of interior, such that pressure on, I mean, because I'm not sure, unless there's like, you know, a longer term economic turn in the real estate dynamics of cities like Toronto, it's not as if, you know, say the 40 square meter or 400 square foot apartment is going to go away, but they aren't really subdividable. They're micro units. So, I mean, I guess this rumination on a different sensibility about interiors, you know, a flexibility and utility that comes from divisibility is something that might require a more extended urban landscape. perhaps not, not a return to the post-war suburbs of the 1950s, but some kind of density which is in between, say, high-density garden cities or something less than traditional downtowns. But we'll see. I mean, of course, the process of suburbanization was the product of of many intersecting factors in terms of real estate development to some extent, Cold War planning and fears, and automobilization, the development of automobile. So I don't know if we have such a, I guess, constellation of forces that will have quite the same impact in the period after COVID-19 in terms of urban form. But certainly people may be more inclined to distance themselves for some time to come. But I mean, you mentioned, Carie, before we began the interview, you raised the question of, I guess, I'll call it spatial sensibilities, which is something that I've been thinking a lot about. And, that there was, I guess, one of the characteristics, perhaps a cliche of modernist architecture was an idea about opening up the plan, opening up spatial syntax such that there was greater continuity between spaces within, but also continuity in terms of relationships between interior and exterior. And I think that those are still, for a lot of architects and people inclined towards, I guess, design tastes, that kind of open planning still has a certain kind of currency in the world of architecture and certain taste cultures, and perhaps that will change. I used to have, I guess it's hard to call it a debate, but when you have different sensibilities, discussions of these differing sensibilities with a friend of mine who described his desire to, within his home, to be able to see the entirety of his environment all at once, to take it in an instant. And I on the other hand, found that very depressing. Somehow that my house had no mystery for me. The prospect of having nowhere to go that I couldn't already see seemed like a kind of confinement. And so I live in a house now that has many rooms and feel that I'm happy. And that's a question in many respects of privilege as well, that I have a more complex environment of many chambers that I can inhabit during this time of confinement. It also obviously makes it possible, where necessary, for isolation during the time of illness, which is something that on a more practical level people are looking at. But I was thinking, that, I mean, the prospect for this kind of interior environment is one which is, it requires a certain kind of a spatial luxury. And at the same time, there were architects, and I kind of thought about Rietveld's Schroeder house as an example of a somewhat modest environment where the idea of partition was available, mutable, but available. And I also, it was funny because I was thinking there was an issue of in architecture and technology, a Spanish journal, A+T, that was many years ago, I think even decades ago. Its second edition was themed on flexibility. And the thesis of the issue was that flexibility, which had often been connected with open spatial environments, was mistakenly connected with open space environments, but in fact was more properly produced by spatial division. That in a multiplicity of rooms, that you could choose uses more freely and more easily because of the ability to divide activities and reassign the use of spaces. So I guess I wonder if there may be a shift in sensibility when people have to contend with long-term confinement within their environments. And likewise, obviously, with the prospect of returning to work, but without full herd immunity to COVID-19, social distancing may still be in place. So the the historical evolution of open space office environments may also be something which is transformed. And I think of it as coming from two different perspectives. One of them is resolving practical challenges that come from, I guess, a medical consideration of environments. And then the other one that may come from changes in sensibility that come from being housebound or interior-bound confinements for long periods of time, something of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, I think your comments kind of beautifully straddle the two ends, the collective, when you speak about density in the cities, to individual dwelling. And I think, again, depending on how long this lasts, we may see some or none of these play out. But I think it leaves me with things to consider and think about. So I'm grateful, and thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to talk to you.
Thanks, Robert.